At 78 years old, Ruth Callahan had 11 days left before the county board would vote on whether to declare her farmhouse unfit for a woman living alone. That same week, a manila envelope arrived in her mailbox, addressed not to her, but to the barn. The screen door still had the same hinge squeal it had carried since 1962, the year Ruth's father hung it crooked and never fixed it, because he said a house should announce its people. Every morning she made her coffee in a percolator that hissed instead of beeped. And every morning she carried the second cup outside and poured it into the dirt beside the barn door, a habit no one had ever asked her to explain, and she had never offered to. She had buried a husband, a sister, and a stillborn son on this land. She had watched the county pave over the gravel road her father once walked to sell eggs, and she had watched her own children grow up and drive away from Ohio the way young people did now, chasing cities that didn't smell like cut hay. She did not resent them for leaving. She resented quietly that they had stopped believing she could stay. The barn door was old oak, silvered by 80 years of weather, and carved into its surface were symbols, some shallow and worn, some sharp and recent, arranged in rows that meant nothing to anyone who looked at them and asked. Ruth never explained the marks, not to her late husband, not to her children, not to the sheriff's deputy, who'd once joked that it looked like witch stuff. Every October, on a date she never told anyone, she took her father's carving knife from the kitchen drawer, walked to the barn, and added one more symbol to the door. It was the only ritual in her life she had never broken. That morning, holding her coffee, she looked at the barn door the way she looked at it every day, like a letter she had never learned to read but trusted completely, and felt something she couldn't yet name, a change in the air that had nothing to do with weather. Ruth's daughter Diane called that same afternoon, her voice carrying the particular gentleness people use right before they say something unkind. "Mom, the Hendersons said you were out at the barn again last night, past dark, with a flashlight." Ruth didn't answer right away. She was standing at the kitchen window, watching a truck she didn't recognize slow down at the end of her driveway before continuing on. "I was just checking the latch," she said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. Diane had been building a case for months now, one concerned phone call at a time. Ruth knew what the case was for, even if her daughter dressed it in softer words. Assisted living, a smaller place in town, someone checking on her twice a day. The county's Aging Property Review Board had sent a letter too, citing structural concerns and welfare of the resident, and had scheduled a hearing for the second week of the month. 11 days, the letter said. 11 days until someone else decided whether she still got to live in the house her grandfather built. The neighbors had their own version of the story, the one that traveled faster than facts ever did. Mrs. Kowalski, 3 farms over, told anyone who'd listen that Ruth Callahan had been carving nonsense into that barn since Walter died, implying, without saying it outright, that grief had finally hollowed the old woman out. It didn't matter that Ruth still balanced her own checkbook, still repaired her own fence line, still remembered every neighbor's birthday better than they remembered hers. One strange habit, repeated long enough without explanation, was apparently enough to make people stop trusting your mind. She set her coffee cup on the porch rail and looked again toward the barn. Whatever was coming, and something was coming, she could feel it in the same place she felt weather before the sky changed. She intended to still be standing on this land when it arrived. But what she didn't know was that 70 miles away, in a cramped county records office, the county historian, Thomas Whitfield, had just opened a digitized 1937 survey photograph and gone very still, because the marks in the corner of that old photo, barely visible, half swallowed by shadow, matched a pattern he had spent 6 years trying to find a living example of. The 11 days would not go the way anyone in Ruth Callahan's life expected, least of all her. For the first few days, nothing about the crisis felt urgent so much as exhausting, the way most slow disasters do. The county's letter sat on Ruth's kitchen table, unanswered, its language cold and procedural. Structural concerns regarding barn integrity, isolation risk to resident, recommendation for relocation review. Someone from the county, a woman named Miss Alvarez with a clipboard and an apologetic smile, had already come out once to walk the property, jotting notes about the barn's sagging east wall and the loose porch step Ruth had been meaning to fix for a year. Diane drove up from Columbus on a Thursday with brochures for 2 assisted living facilities tucked into her purse, as if Ruth wouldn't notice the corners poking out. They sat at the kitchen table that had fed 4 generations, and Diane said the word safer 7 times in 20 minutes. Ruth counted. She had gotten good over the years at counting the ways people tried to talk her out of her own life. "I'm not senile, Diane." "Nobody said senile, Mom." "You didn't have to." The argument didn't resolve so much as exhaust itself, the way family arguments do when both people love each other and neither one is willing to be the first to bend. Diane left frustrated. Ruth stood at the window and watched her daughter's car disappear down the gravel road, then walked out to the barn and rested her palm flat against the door, against the rows of carved symbols, the way she sometimes did when she needed the quiet to hold still around her. She thought, not for the first time, about the years she'd spent fielding questions she had no real answers for. Her husband Walter had asked her once, early in their marriage, why she disappeared to the barn every October with her father's old knife, and she told him the truth as she understood it then. "It's a family thing, and I don't fully know why, but I know I'm supposed to keep doing it." Walter had accepted that answer for 31 years of marriage without ever pushing harder, and she had loved him for that particular kind of trust more than she'd ever told him. Her children had not inherited his patience. Growing up in a house with a mother who kept an unexplained ritual made Diane and her brother Peter uneasy in a way that had only sharpened with the years, the unexplained thing curdling slowly into a symptom, a red flag, a reason to worry. It was 2 days later that the strangers started showing up. The first was a young man in a county truck, measuring the barn's foundation with a laser level, who told her, not unkindly, that if the structure was condemned, everything inside it would need to be cleared before demolition. Ruth asked what he meant by everything. He shrugged. "Rules were rules," he said. "Old barns got torn down all the time." The second stranger came on foot up the long driveway in the early evening when the light went gold and low across the fields. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitfield, the county historian. And he asked, with a carefulness that made Ruth immediately suspicious, whether he might look at her barn door. She almost said no. In 50 years, no one outside her family had ever asked to look at the door. They'd only ever whispered about it from a distance, the way people whisper about things that frighten them a little. But something in the way Thomas said look, reverent instead of curious, made her step aside. He didn't touch the wood. He stood in front of it for a long moment, then pulled a folded photocopy from his bag, a grainy black and white image from 1937, and held it up beside the door without a word. Ruth's breath caught before her mind had even finished understanding why. "I wrote ahead," Thomas said, almost apologetically. The records were incomplete, and the property had changed hands so many times that county files still listed it under the old barn designation. I wasn't sure who would receive the envelope, so I addressed it to the structure itself. Ruth thought of the unopened envelope still sitting on her hallway table, and understood for the first time that the barn had been receiving its own mail long before she'd been ready to answer for it. Mrs. Callahan, Thomas said quietly. Do you know what these symbols mean? I know what my father told me, she said. That's all I've ever known. Can I ask what he told you? She didn't answer right away. Behind her, the barn's east wall groaned faintly in the wind, the sound of a structure that had outlived most of the people who built it, holding on the way old things do, stubbornly, and not for much longer without help. The county truck came back twice more that week, and each visit chipped away a little more of Ruth's certainty that she'd win the hearing on her own terms. A contractor walked the barn's perimeter with a clipboard and used the word condemnable out loud, close enough for her to hear it through the kitchen window. Mrs. Kowalski stopped by uninvited, ostensibly with a casserole, and spent most of the visit steering the conversation toward the phone number of a lovely little place near her sister in Dayton. Ruth thanked her for the casserole and said nothing about the number. Diane called every evening now, her voice tight with a worry that had started to sound less like concern and more like a countdown. Ruth kept the county's letter on the table where she could see it, the 11 days ticking down in the corner of her vision every time she made coffee, and she found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, doubting whether stubbornness alone would be enough this time. What Ruth didn't say, not yet, was that her father had told her the marks were a promise, not decoration, that every symbol was carved by someone who needed to be remembered, and that as long as one marsh kept adding to the door, the promise stayed alive. The Marshes were her mother's family, and Ruth had kept the name close in the way some people keep a second key hidden in a drawer. She had never fully understood what the promise was for. She only knew that breaking the tradition had never once felt like an option. Thomas came back 3 more times that week, each visit peeling back one more layer of a mystery Ruth had lived beside her entire life without truly seeing its shape. On his second visit, he brought a folder of archival letters, correspondence between county clerks in the 1850s, fragile and yellowed, referencing the marked farms along what the letters called the Northern Passage. Your barn isn't the only one, he told her, spreading 3 more photographs across her kitchen table. 2 other barns, one now collapsed, one converted into a storage shed for a soybean operation, bore the faint ghosts of similar carvings, weathered nearly to nothing. But yours is the only one still active, the only one where someone kept adding to it. Ruth stared at the photographs longer than she meant to. Active, she repeated. You're talking about it like it's a machine. It might be something better than a machine, Thomas said. It might be a code. He explained carefully, in pieces, because even he didn't have the whole picture yet, that the symbols matched a documented but poorly understood signaling system used by a small network of Ohio farm families in the decades before the Civil War. Part of a route historians had only ever pieced together from fragments. A system for marking which farms were safe, which had recently been searched, which direction led toward the next safe crossing. The full route had never been mapped. Most of its markers were assumed lost. But what I don't understand, Thomas said, is why your family kept carving new symbols. That practice should have ended 160 years ago. Ruth didn't have an answer for him. Not yet. She had a promise, inherited and unexplained, passed down like a family Bible nobody read, but everybody kept on the shelf out of respect. She hadn't ever asked her father why they kept going. It hadn't occurred to her as a girl that the tradition might have an ending it was still waiting to reach. That night, alone in the farmhouse, Ruth went looking for the old cedar box in her closet, the one that held her father's letters and a few photographs too faded to make out clearly anymore. Buried near the bottom, wrapped in a linen handkerchief gone soft with age, She found a single page in handwriting that wasn't her father's. Older, more formal, the ink brown to the color of dried tobacco. She didn't finish reading it that night. Her eyes were too tired, and her hands, for the first time in years, were shaking too much to hold the page steady. But the first line was enough to keep her awake until dawn. To whoever still carries the door forward, you are not the first, and you must not be the last. By the time Thomas returned at the end of the week, Ruth had read the letter 11 times and had gone from disbelief to something closer to grief. The strange, delayed grief of realizing a burden you carried without complaint had, in fact, always been an honor. The letter, dated 1861 and signed only with the initials R.C., a coincidence in the shared initials that made Ruth's throat tighten every time she looked at it, described a network of families who had used the carved symbols to guide freedom seekers north along a route that avoided the main roads patrolled by slave catchers. Each family added their own mark to its barn door as both a signal and a vow, proof to anyone who understood the code that this farm could be trusted, and a private oath, passed from one generation to the next, that the marking would never stop, not because the danger remained, but because forgetting was its own kind of danger. "Your family wasn't just part of the route," Thomas said, once Ruth had shown him the letter and watched him read it twice, his hands as unsteady as hers had been. "Based on this, and on the density of symbols on your door compared to every other example we've found, I think your farm might have been the route's central relay point, the place other farms took their signal from." It should have felt like triumph. Instead, sitting in her kitchen with a 200-year-old secret spread across the table, Ruth mostly felt the weight of every year she'd spent quietly defending a tradition she had never fully understood, while people who loved her whispered that she was losing her mind. The complication, when it arrived, wasn't dramatic. It was bureaucratic, which in some ways was worse. Thomas explained that securing historical protection for the farm, the kind of designation that would stop the county's demolition order and silence permanently any talk of declaring the property unsafe, required more than his word and one old letter. It required verified documentation, corroborating records, a formal site survey, testimony, and crucially, an intact, undisturbed structure for state historians to examine before the county's hearing date, which left Ruth with a cruel arithmetic. The barn's east wall, the one Ms. Alvarez had flagged as structurally unsound, was also the wall holding the largest and oldest concentration of carved symbols, the ones most likely to prove her case. If the county condemned the barn before the historical review was complete, the very evidence that could save the farm would be torn down in the process of protecting her. "I can request an emergency hold on the demolition," Thomas told her. "But I won't lie to you, Mrs. Callahan. County boards don't love overriding local families for outside historians. If it comes down to your word against a wall that's structurally failing, I don't know which way it goes." There was, he said carefully, another option, one that didn't rely on the county changing its mind at all. If Ruth herself could locate additional supporting evidence, letters, records, anything from the family archive that corroborated the 1861 letter, a stronger, faster case could bypass the local board entirely and go straight to the state historical registry. But the archive Thomas needed access to wasn't digitized. It existed, if it existed at all, somewhere in 80 years of accumulated family paper Ruth hadn't fully sorted since her father died. She spent the next 4 days doing something she had avoided her entire adult life, going through every box in the attic, every trunk in the cellar, every drawer in a house that had never once been organized with strangers' eyes in mind. Her hands ached by the second day. Her knees Climbing the attic stairs a dozen times ached worse. Diane called twice, worried, and Ruth, for the first time in months, didn't have the energy to argue back, only to say, "I'm looking for something, and I need you to trust me a little longer." The work was slower than she expected, and lonelier. 60 years of accumulated paper didn't organize itself by importance. A stack of unpaid utility bills from 1988 sat beside a photograph of her mother as a young bride, and both had to be sorted with the same patient hands. She found herself grieving small things she hadn't expected to grieve. Her father's handwriting on a seed order form, a hair ribbon that must have belonged to her stillborn son's older sister, a box of Walter's tools that still smelled faintly of machine oil after 12 years. Thomas checked in by phone each evening, careful never to pressure her, though she could hear the tension underneath his patience. The state registry's fast-track review had its own deadline, one that ran almost exactly parallel to the county's. By the second night, she'd developed a system, sorting by decade instead of by box, and still found nothing that mentioned symbols, routes, or promises. She began to wonder if her father had been the last to actually know the story behind the ritual, and if he, too, had simply been carving from inherited instinct rather than understanding, which would mean the truth Thomas needed might not exist in any drawer at all, only in ash, in things thrown away decades before anyone thought to ask. On the third day, she found nothing but false hope. A box of recipes, a box of her mother's church bulletins, a box of photographs with no names written on the back. She began, quietly, to doubt whether the truth Thomas needed even still existed, whether it had been lost the way most inconvenient histories eventually were, not through malice, just through the slow erosion of nobody thinking to ask in time. It was past midnight on the fourth night, exhausted, her hands trembling from more than age, that Ruth almost gave up. She sat on the attic floor, surrounded by open boxes, and thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that maybe it would be easier to let the county win. Move to town. Let someone else worry about the wall, the barn, the door, the promise. She was 78 years old. She had buried a husband and a child and a sister. Maybe there was no shame in finally putting something down. She might have stopped there if her hand hadn't brushed at the very back of the last unopened trunk, a false bottom her father had built decades ago. The kind of hidden compartment a man builds only for things he means to protect. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept out 80 years of Ohio winters, Ruth found a ledger. Not a diary, not a letter, a record. Names, dates, a rough hand-drawn map of farms marked with the same symbols carved into her barn door, and notes in at least 4 different handwritings spanning what looked like a full century of careful, secret stewardship. She sat on the attic floor and cried for the first time since her husband's funeral. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to recognition. The feeling of finally understanding the shape of a promise she had spent her whole life keeping without asking why. The county hearing arrived exactly on schedule. 11 days, almost to the hour after the letter had first arrived at her mailbox, and by then, with barely a night to spare, the State Historical Office had confirmed the ledger's authenticity and the significance of what it documented. Because the discovery involved an emergency preservation request tied to a threatened historic structure, the review had been fast-tracked through state channels in a way that ordinary cases never were. Ruth Callahan walked into that meeting room carrying not brochures for assisted living, but a ledger 2 centuries old and a great-great-grandmother's promise finally spoken aloud instead of simply carried. She didn't need to convince the board with tears or with pleading. The ledger did that on its own, page after page, name after name, Dozens of people who had passed through this land seeking freedom, guided safely north because a marsh, generation after generation, kept adding one more mark to a barn door and never once explained why. Ms. Alvarez, who had once flagged the property for isolation risk, sat quietly at the back of the room and afterward was the first to shake Ruth's hand. The board's vote wasn't close. The farm was granted emergency historical protection status, pending full state registry review, a designation that didn't just save the barn from demolition, but placed the entire property under a preservation order that made any future talk of forced relocation effectively impossible. The county, in an unusual reversal, offered funding to help stabilize the structure instead of condemning it. News of the vote traveled through the township faster than the old rumors ever had. Mrs. Kowalski, of all people, brought over a second casserole. This one an apology dressed as food, though she never used that word out loud. Ms. Alvarez asked sheepishly whether the Historical Society might need volunteers for the site survey, and Ruth said yes before she'd finished the question. The young man from the county who'd once measured the barn for demolition came back to measure it again, this time for the reinforcement grant, and told her, almost shyly, that his own grandmother had been part of a similar family story, 2 counties over. One nobody in his family had ever bothered to chase down. For Ruth, the strangest part wasn't the vote, or the funding, or even the sudden reversal of a whole community's opinion of her. It was smaller than that. It was Diane, 3 nights after the hearing, asking to see the ledger, not to verify it, not out of duty, but because she wanted to read the names out loud. Diane cried in the parking lot afterward, not from relief about the house, but from something she hadn't expected to feel. Pride tangled with a quiet, aching shame at how close she had come to dismissing her mother's steadiness as confusion. "I thought you were disappearing into something," she admitted. "I didn't understand you were protecting something." "I wasn't sure I understood it either," Ruth said. "Not until I had no choice but to." That autumn, on the date she had never told anyone, the same date she'd kept for over 60 years, Ruth walked out to the barn one more time. The east wall had been repaired now, braced with new timber that hadn't yet weathered to match the old, a visible seam between what had survived and what had been rebuilt to keep it standing. Thomas had asked gently whether she wanted to retire the tradition now that the root's history was finally documented and safe from being forgotten. She had told him no. Some promises, she said, don't end just because the danger that started them has passed. They end when the person carrying them decides they're finished. And she wasn't finished yet. She took her father's carving knife from the kitchen drawer, the handle worn smooth by 4 generations of hands, and walked out into the gold, low light of late afternoon. She poured her coffee into the dirt beside the door, the way she always had. Though this time, Diane stood beside her, watching instead of worrying, and a small crowd of county historians and neighbors, the same neighbors who had once whispered about the strange old woman losing her mind, stood a respectful distance back, finally understanding what they were watching. Ruth pressed the blade to the old oak and carved one more mark beside the others, the newest line in a language that had outlived slavery, outlived war, outlived every person who had ever doubted the woman keeping it alive. It didn't erase the years she had spent misunderstood. It didn't undo the fear of nearly losing everything. But it closed something in her all the same. The door, she realized, had never been a mystery she was hiding. It had been a message she was still delivering, one October at a time, to people who hadn't been born yet. She stepped back and looked at the door the way she had every morning of her life. And for the first time, she wasn't the only one who understood what she was looking at.